house in Denver, Colorado. One evening, her parents decided to attend a late-night party, leaving her alone at home. Sarah, a brave 16-year-old, usually didn't mind being alone, but the storm raging outside made her uneasy. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows, creating an eerie atmosphere. To distract herself, Sarah decided to curl up on the couch in the living room and read a book. Around 11 p.m., just as Sarah was starting to relax, she heard a faint, scratching noise coming from the basement. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, trying to determine if the sound was real. The scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. It seemed to echo in the silence of the house, each scratch amplifying her fear. Gathering her courage, Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and decided to investigate the noise. The basement door was old and creaky, and as Sarah opened it, the sound seemed to reverberate through the house. She hesitated at the top of the dark staircase, the beam of her flashlight flickering as if in sync with her racing heartbeat. Taking a deep breath, she slowly descended the stairs, each step feeling like a step into the unknown. The scratching noise grew louder with every step she took, echoing off the cold, concrete walls. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Sarah swept the flashlight around the basement. The beam revealed old furniture, boxes, and various household items covered in dust. Then she saw it, a faint outline of a shadowy figure near the far wall. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure seemed to move closer. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the fear was too real to ignore. Suddenly, the flashlight went out, plunging Sarah into complete darkness. Panic set in as she frantically tapped the flashlight, trying to restore the light. When it finally flickered back on, the figure was gone. Sarah let out a shaky sigh of relief, thinking it might have been a trick of the light. But just as she was about to turn and leave, she felt a cold, bony hand grab her ankle from behind. Sarah screamed, kicking and thrashing to free herself from the icy grip. The hand tightened, and she could feel its cold, unnatural strength. Summoning all her strength, she managed to pull free and sprinted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. She locked herself in her room, trembling and crying, too terrified to call her parents or the police. The fear of what had grabbed her kept her awake all night. Hours later, the parents returned home to find Sarah huddled in the corner of her room, clutching the flashlight. They were shocked and worried when she tearfully recounted what had happened. Her father immediately went down to the basement to check, but he found nothing unusual. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have grabbed her ankle. Despite not finding anything, Sarah refused to go down to the basement ever again. The incident left Sarah shaken, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen. Sarah would hear footsteps when she was alone, and objects would move on their own. Her parents tried to reassure her, but they couldn't deny that something was wrong. They decided to bring in a priest to bless the house, hoping to rid it of whatever presence was causing the disturbances. The priest performed a blessing, and for a while, things seemed to return to normal. But Sarah couldn't forget the cold, bony hand that had grabbed her. She still felt uneasy in her own home, especially at night. She started sleeping with her bedroom door locked and a light on, hoping to keep the fear at bay. Her parents noticed the change in her behavior and became increasingly concerned. One night, a few months later, Sarah woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, but seemed to be coming from inside her room. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. The whispering grew louder, and she realized it was coming from the corner of her room where the shadowy figure had stood that night. The fear she had tried to suppress resurfaced, stronger than ever. Sarah couldn't see anything in the darkness, but she felt a cold presence. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it towards the corner. To her horror, she saw the faint outline of the shadowy figure. It was watching her, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She screamed, and her parents rushed into her room. The figure disappeared as soon as they entered, leaving her parents baffled and scared. The parents tried to comfort her, but Sarah was inconsolable. They realized that whatever was haunting their daughter was not going to go away easily. They decided it was time to move out of the house. Within a few weeks, they found a new place to live and packed their belongings. Sarah felt a sense of relief, hoping that leaving the house would mean leaving the terror behind. The new house was warm and welcoming, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt safe. She slowly started to regain her confidence, and the memories of the basement and the shadowy figure began to fade. However, every now and then, she would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a cold presence in the room. She would lie there, too scared to move, wondering if the shadowy figure had followed her to her new home. Sarah never spoke about the incident again, but the fear stayed with her. She learned to live with it, but she knew she would never forget the night she encountered the shadow in the basement. Her parents continued to support her, but they too were haunted by the thought of what might have happened if they had stayed in the old house. As time went on, Sarah tried to put the past behind her. She focused on her studies and hobbies, surrounding herself with friends and positive experiences. Yet, deep down, she knew that the shadow in the basement had left an indelible mark on her life. The experience had taught her to trust her instincts and to be cautious, for she had learned the hard way that some fears are not just in our minds. They can be very real. Story 2. The Silent Watcher. Mark was a college student living in a small rented house off campus in Leeds, England. One weekend, his roommates decided to go home, leaving him alone in the house. Mark was looking forward to the quiet, planning to catch up on his studies and relax. From the moment he was alone, he began to feel like someone was watching him. It was a subtle but persistent feeling, like an itch he couldn't scratch. As Mark sat in the living room, he heard faint footsteps upstairs. He brushed it off as the house settling, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He tried to ignore it and went to bed early, hoping to shake off the eerie sensation. Around midnight, he woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards just outside his bedroom door. He lay still, holding his breath, and listened intently. Mark's heart pounded as he listened to the slow, deliberate footsteps. Gathering his courage, he opened the door and peeked out. The hallway was empty. He sighed in relief and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore, and he found himself lying awake, listening for any other sounds. He kept telling himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. The next day, Mark decided to investigate. He checked all the rooms and closets, but found nothing unusual. He tried to focus on his studies, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That night, he locked his bedroom door and kept a baseball bat by his bed, hoping it would provide some sense of security. He double-checked the locks on the windows and doors, trying to reassure himself that he was safe. Around 2 a.m., Mark woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was definitely there. Mark strained to hear the words, but they were garbled, like a radio signal just out of reach. He grabbed the bat and slowly opened the door, his heart racing with fear and anticipation. The whispering seemed to be coming from the end of the hallway. To his horror, he saw a shadowy figure at the end of the hallway. The figure was tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It didn't move, just stood there watching him. Mark's blood ran cold as he backed into his room and locked the door. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast, as he tried to process what he had just seen. The figure's presence felt overwhelmingly sinister. The whispering grew louder, filling his room with an eerie, disembodied chatter. Mark covered his ears, trying to block it out, but the voices seemed to come from within his head. Desperate, he called his roommate, asking him to come back as soon as possible. His voice trembled as he tried to explain the situation. His roommate could hear the fear in his voice and promised to return immediately. His roommate arrived early the next morning. The moment he stepped into the house, the voices stopped. Mark explained everything, but his roommate was skeptical. Together, they searched the house but found no evidence of anyone else being there. Despite the lack of proof, Mark was convinced that the shadowy figure was real. He described the figure in detail, but his roommate remained unconvinced. Mark never stayed alone in that house again. The silent watcher, with its glowing eyes and haunting whispers, remained a terrifying mystery. Even after moving out, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next moment he was alone. The fear had become a part of him, a constant companion. He felt its presence even in the brightest of days. Mark decided to see a therapist to help him deal with the fear and anxiety. The therapist listened patiently and suggested that Mark keep a journal of his experiences. Writing down his thoughts and fears helped Mark to some extent, but the terror of that night remained. He found it difficult to trust his own senses, constantly questioning what was real and what was not. The shadowy figure had left a deep scar on his psyche. One evening, while he was writing in his journal, Mark heard a faint tapping on his window. He froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned to look, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, growing louder. Mark mustered his courage and walked to the window. As he pulled back the curtain, he saw the faint outline of the shadowy figure, its eyes glowing in the darkness. He stumbled back, knocking over his chair. Mark screamed and stumbled back, knocking over his chair. The figure disappeared, but the fear remained. He realized that the silent watcher had indeed followed him. This realization filled him with dread, but also a strange sense of acceptance. He knew he had to find a way to live with this fear. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just a figment of his imagination, but deep down he knew it was real. Mark continued his therapy, focusing on building coping mechanisms to manage his anxiety. He also began researching paranormal phenomena, hoping to find some explanation for his experiences. The more he learned, the more he realized that his situation was not unique. Others have reported similar encounters with shadowy figures and disembodied voices. He found solace in knowing he wasn't alone. Despite the fear, Mark refused to let it control his life. He graduated from college and found a job in a new city. He hoped that the change of scenery would help him move on, but the fear of the silent watcher never completely left him. He remained vigilant, always aware of his surroundings, always listening for the faintest sound of whispering. He developed a keen sense of awareness, always on edge. Years later, Mark had learned to live with the fear. He had built a successful career and even started a family, but every now and then he would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a cold presence in the room. He would lie there, too scared to move, wondering if the silent watcher was still with him. The experience had changed him, teaching him to trust his instincts and to be cautious, for he had learned that some fears are not just in our minds. They can be very real. One night, Mark's wife, Emma, woke up to find him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. She called his name, but he didn't respond. She walked over and gently touched his arm, breaking his trance. Mark turned to her, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. He whispered that he had seen the figure again, standing in the yard watching them. Emma tried to comfort him, but she was scared too. She had never seen Mark so terrified. She suggested that they call a priest to bless their home, hoping it would help. Mark agreed, willing to try anything to rid himself of the silent watcher. The priest came the next day and performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers in every room. For a while, things seemed to improve. The house felt lighter and Mark's anxiety lessened. But one night, the whispering returned. Mark woke up to the sound of soft, eerie voices filling the room. He covered his ears, trying to block it out, but the voices seemed to penetrate his very soul. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder and turned to see the shadowy figure standing beside his bed. Mark screamed, waking Emma. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the terror lingered. Emma held Mark as he sobbed, feeling helpless and afraid. They decided to move again, hoping that a fresh start in a new place would finally free them from the haunting presence of the silent watcher. They sold their house and moved to a different city, far away from Leeds. In their new home, Mark and Emma tried to rebuild their lives. They decorated their house with bright, cheerful colors and filled it with love and laughter. For a while, things seemed normal. But late at night, when the house was silent and the world was asleep, Mark would sometimes wake up, feeling the cold presence of the silent watcher. He knew that no matter where he went, the fear would follow. The experience had left a mark on his soul, a reminder that some fears are not just in our minds, they are very real and very dangerous.